We've had a series of presidents in a row who just have taken the policy, and in my view it means the American nation, in the wrong direction with Communist China. We should not be extending such trade favors. You know, those really are tariff breaks that are given to these, dictators, who are abusing their own people with their profits, with the winning that they get from these, negotiations. And as I think about it, when Bill Clinton negotiated unconditional free trade with China, how much negotiation does it take? All you have to do is say, well, I'm wrapping it all up, here you go. In other words, Bill Clinton gave them everything that they could have wanted in that negotiation, in the relationship, and even perhaps more than a dictator could ask for.
Right, that explains why the Chinese leaders on that regime, they probably very much like Bill Clinton. Now, but the mainstream China policy come from today, shaped today back. We can trace that back to late 1970s. At that time, it's still Cold War, and the U.S. enemy is Soviet Union. So back then, the China policy is try to engage with China so we can make China our allies to counter USSR at that time. And of course, that model carried to today. And of course, there's no Soviet Union now, we only have Russia, but that policy still carries today. And it's kind of, the weight of the self and the motion itself will keep going for a while. It's very difficult to change, isn't it?
It's true that after the Soviet Union fell, that there certainly should have been a review, from top to bottom of United States-China policy. In fact, it was only 3 or 4 years earlier that the Tiananmen Square massacre had produced this bloody scene, on world television. Everyone got to see the blood, the guts, the gore of students and innocent civilians, who were standing for democracy. Now that should have caused an enormous review of China policy.
That is true, though. It is Bill Clinton at that time, and he said, yes, there is no Soviet Union, there's no need for China policy, but he spin it a little bit, and he's saying, okay, time is on our side, history is on our side, and the main thinking is if we engage with China, if we stimulate the middle class, and when the middle class becomes strong enough, they are going to ask for freedom. They are going to ask for more political power. Now, 30 years has passed, and China has went through enormous economic growth. Still, there's no democracy, no more freedom. And I know you founded the China Support Network. Now, are you disappointed that after 30 years, nothing changed?
I'm very disappointed. And you're right that the Chinese people may demand their freedom. That is still a developing situation. In other words, China has unrest even right now. So, it could come to pass, in fact, that the Chinese people stand up against the dictators. But it's not the case that they do so because China has a trade surplus with the United States. The trade surplus with the United States has been gravy, and for communists and dictators and tyrants and thugs. And so the China policy has served to form a gravy train, and it's also shortchanged the American people. It has shipped their jobs offshore. And in the old days, or when I learned politics during the Cold War, to create jobs in a political district, was priority one. In other words, job one of politicians was the creation of jobs. Employment is issue number one. And in fact, if we are now having an economic downturn, it is again becoming issue number one, employment. And so how do hypocritical politicians square, their trade policy with the need for domestic employment inside the United States?
Now, with the president-elect Obama will be the president next January, and do you have a different hope for him that he might do something to alter the China policy?
Well, the next few months will tell us whether, Barack Obama is good for the change that he advertised.
President-elect Obama said during the campaign, and he said he proposed to ban all the Chinese-made goods because they're especially dairy products. He also said if he were the United States president, he would not go to the Beijing Olympic opening ceremonies. But on the other side, I know a lot of presidents there, they were very critical before they became president, but when they become the president, they become more pragmatic. And do you expect Mr. Obama will do the same?
There is the public sector on the one hand, and there is the private sector on the other hand. And what that means is there's government, and then there are commercial business interests. And these are not one and the same. In other words, in the old days, we used to understand there was a separation of public and private sectors. If we were truly doing right by the public sector, we would have a far stronger United States-China policy. And the fact that we have the weaker China policy basically suggests that the government is doing the bidding of the private sector. And I feel that in our nation here in the United States that we need to once again have separation of public and private sectors.
Now, if you have a chance to, hypothetically, if you have a chance to meet with President-elect Obama and you have 45 minutes, what will you propose specifically to him about the change on China policy?
Well, there would be a go big option and perhaps a go medium option. And let me take those two. The first is go big, which means withdraw from the World Trade Organization. And after withdrawing from the World Trade Organization, then there are about 5 or 6 different tariffs that I would care to impose against Chinese exports. And that means a tyranny tariff, one tariff that is simply because, you are not a part of the free world. But then there can be a tariff, that relates to environmental protections. If the standards are lower in China, they get a tariff. There can be another tariff for labor protections. If the standards are lower in China, they get a tariff. There can be another tariff for consumer protection. If the standards are lower in China, they get a tariff. There's also possibly a currency manipulation tariff, a corrective tariff. And this has already been proposed. There's been a bill in the Senate that says, let's add this tariff to Chinese goods simply to correct the imbalance because China has manipulated the value of its currency.
But only when Obama administration will label China as a currency manipulator. Isn't that right?
Well, I hope that they will be labeled as such. The simple fact is that the manipulation of the currency is economic dirty pool. It tilts the playing field. And I believe that any U.S. president ought to care to have a level playing field for the business concerns here vis-a-vis the business concerns in China. And so to level the playing field, the currency corrective tariff is important, but so too is that labor tariff, which I spoke about, simply because the employment of slave labor is another means of tilting the playing field. The other option is to go medium, and that's, I've been working with Chinese dissidents who were bitterly opposed to the PNTR free trade deal. And they were opposed because there were no preconditions, no strings attached, nothing that suggests China should improve its human rights practices. Now, originally, it was a campaign promise of Bill Clinton to link the renewal of trade with China to progress on human rights. And so the dissidents I work with, they would very much like to have the removal of PNTR and the renewal of MFN with linkage to human rights. Now, from my angle, I am an American, and I know that the trade deficit is hurting the U.S. economy. And so in the better interests of the American economy, we have got to reduce that trade deficit. All right, and so my preference is the go big option. In other words, I want, the imposition of tariffs that genuinely slow down the flood of Chinese exports. But a go medium option would simply renew trade with, perhaps 1 year of time that allows the communist government to improve its human rights practices.